wiped out the.
Are y'all waiting for us to be quiet?
Yep.
That
We're
was a
good?
direct
Okay.
answer.
No, we were actually waiting to get confirmation the stream was on. Good morning, I'm Charlie Huguenard. I'm the Vice Chair of the Infrastructure Recovery Board and filling in for our Chair, Tim, who's calling in. I'd like to welcome everybody to the February 10th, 2026 meeting of the Infrastructure Recovery Board. Board members are participating in person and virtually. To help our audience follow along, I'll state each section of the agenda aloud. We're streaming live on our virtual engagement hub, which is accessible through the virtual engagement hub link on the front page of the city website. We also have an option for the public to listen live by phone. For those of you out there with us today, welcome. For today's meeting, we have the option for people to call in and listen or comment live. To call in and listen to the meeting, please dial 855-925-2801 and enter the meeting code 2535. Your phone will be muted and you will hear the meeting live. At this point, if you would like to sign up to speak, you will need to push *3 to enter the speaker queue. We'll take public comment at the end of the meeting. Before we get started with our roll call, I'd like to take a moment to remind everybody why we're here. The City of Asheville Helene Recovery Boards were established to support City Council's vision of a recovery that is rooted in resilience, rises in unity, repairs with care, and ready for tomorrow. The 4 boards represent City Council's priority areas of economy, housing, infrastructure, environment, and people. Through collaboration, expertise, and insight, each of the 4 boards will provide critical input on City Council policy recommendations while also extending the City of Asheville's communications through board member networks. I'll introduce all the board members and staff. For members participating remotely, please make sure to mute your microphone if you're not speaking and unmute your microphone when you would like to speak. As I call your name, please say a quick hello. Kate Ankaya.
Hello.
Kenny Armstrong.
Hello.
Joe Balkin.
Hello.
Marty Benson.
Hello.
AJ Hardy.
Hello.
Shavonda Harper.
Hello.
Michael Holcomb.
Good morning and hello.
David Nutter. Good morning. Tim Ormond.
Morning, good evening, and namaste from India, everybody.
Nice. John Pierce.
Good morning.
Brad Branham, City Attorney. D. Tyrell McGirt, Parks and Recreation Director.
Good morning.
Christy Bass, Parks and Recreation. And I'm Charlie Huguenard. So for our first agenda item, approval of minutes. The minutes from last meeting on January 12th are linked in the agenda. Do we have a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting.
Have a second?
Second.
All right. So because we're hybrid meeting, we'll need to do a roll call vote. So to call your name, please indicate your vote. Kate Ankaya,
Aye.
Kenny Armstrong,
Aye.
Joe Balkin,
Aye.
Marty Benson,
Aye.
AJ Hardy,
Aye.
Shavonda Harper,
Aye.
Michael Holcomb,
Aye.
David Nutter, Tim Ormond,
Aye.
John Pierce,
Aye.
and Charlie Huguenard. Aye. Motion carries. All right, to the meat of this meeting, I'm going to let D. Tyrell and Bridget take over and fill us in on what we're talking about today.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. D. Tyrell McGirt, Staff Liaison for the Infrastructure Recovery Board. The meat of this meeting is to discuss some pros and cons that Bridget, our recovery coordinator, is going to get into regarding funding for our upcoming infrastructure projects. We'll do a deep dive into the existing projects and get a better understanding of the funding structure that we have before us, as well as understand what some pros and cons are going to look like for making a decision for funding some of these recovery projects under consideration. And now I'll turn it over to Bridget Herring.
All right. Good afternoon. Is this a good sound check? Yeah, for online? Okay, great. Good morning. Bridget Herring, Recovery Coordinator with the City of Asheville. So as Dee mentioned, here to talk to you today about basically like a funding strategy for some of our recovery projects. So not going to a deep dive into the project specifics, which you've heard at some of your previous meetings and you will hear at your future meetings, but really talking about how we prioritize the resources that we have available to get some of these projects done. And today we're focusing specifically on the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, or CDBG-DR funds that were made available to the city early last year. So moving on to the next slide. I was gonna set this up, but you did a great job to say what is council's vision to ground us in what we're here to work towards, the outcomes, as we start to make some of these operational decisions to make sure the outcomes meet the decisions that we're making in the day-to-day. So I'm going to start with the end in mind in our recommendation, then back up and provide some context so that you can have that in mind as we move through the conversation before we move into discussion. So in the next slide, the ultimate recommendation that we are making is to use our CDBG-DR infrastructure funds for 3 primary projects that have surfaced out of Tropical Storm Helene. So the first 2 are really focusing on the parks projects, the Riverfront projects. These are places where we saw significant damage as a result of the storm. And we want to find an opportunity to take a comprehensive approach to their rebuilding and think about that both from a resilience perspective, but also from like an enhanced opportunity for our community to have access to recreational experience. So kind of a twofold opportunity that we see specific with the CDBG-DR funds. And then the third project is the permanent pretreatment project out at the North Fork Reservoir, which can help us handle some of those fluctuations in turbidity to be able to more continuously deliver high-quality potable water to our community, which we all know is essential because we got to live without it for quite some time. So then backing up and talking about the actual program, the city of Asheville was able to receive a $225 million allocation from the Housing and Urban Development Department from the federal government, more commonly referred to as HUD. And in that, part of that process when you receive that allocation is to do an analysis of the different types of funding buckets that money comes with, which you can see listed in the category section of this table, to say what data is available post-disaster to understand what's kind of the scope of the need that exists in these different categories that won't be addressed with existing recovery federal funds that we know will be available to a community. So when we looked around, so in terms of like housing, you could think of how many people do we know have housing insurance? How many homes were damaged? How many people are going to be able to take advantage of individual assistance, which maybe some of you applied for through FEMA, that paid for like some housing, maybe some rental assistance, and then what's left over, like what's the gap? And so when we did kind of a high-level assessment of city infrastructure that was damaged and what we thought would be covered through primarily the FEMA Public Assistance Project, we estimated a $900 million gap. And that's just an estimate, but I think it illustrates the need that there's a larger amount of need than we have resources available, which is why we have to figure out what are we gonna do with those resources to address that gap. So per the action plan, that kind of lays out the framework for what each of these programs can fund. And the infrastructure allocation prioritizes resilience, long-term recovery, and city-owned assets. As you can see in the highlighted box, the program allocation that we have out of that $225 million is $125 million. These are federal dollars, which means that even though they might be more flexible in terms of the actual things you can do with it, it is not more flexible in terms of how you comply with spending federal dollars, right? And so there's a lot of regulatory requirements that go around with making sure you're building it to those standards, you're avoiding fraud, waste, and abuse, all of that good stuff. And so that comes at a cost. And so that kind of compliance cost gets taken out of the program. And what's actually left to fund project implementation is that $122 million and change number that you see in that second bullet. And the other thing I think that's important to know about this specific funding resource is that It needs to tie to a national objective. The one we most commonly talk about is benefiting our low and moderate income residents, and that it's also considered the funding of last resort, meaning that all other federal funding
carries.
sources dedicated to recovery must be
All right,
pursued before using
to
this.
the meat of the
A voice from above. All right. So, moving on. This is a little Recovery Funding 101 primer. So if any of you watched the presentation that Assistant City Manager Jay Dundas delivered to council in the video, I believe, that was sent with the program materials, he goes into the different funding sources. This is my 2-minute Cliff Note version. And the way that I think about the funding resources we have available to us is there's a base level, and then we build and stack on top of that, right? And so you have kind of your foundation, and then you add things on as you go. So starting at the bottom, our foundation or our base is what's listed here as FEMA PA. PA stands for Public Assistance. And this is a program that's available to communities following a presidential national disaster declaration that says we will repair what was damaged from the storm and nothing beyond that. So you have a section of greenway, it all looks good, 5 feet in the middle gets torn up, they're gonna fix the 5 feet. They're not looking at the rest, right? And maybe there's some opportunity for mitigation. Maybe they say, well, let's raise that one little section so that maybe the water will run off instead of being depressed and water can collect. But that's when we talk about mitigation opportunities. They're kind of limited to what's the minimal thing we could do to maybe use a different pavement type or something to make it more resilient. And we're using FEMA public assistance in the Riverfront Recovery Parks projects because we had a lot of damage there. The next layer is what's listed here as HMGP grants. That stands for Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That's something that's administered through FEMA and actually works with the state. So we partner with the state North Carolina Emergency Management to submit things to them. Then they submit on as an applicant as the state, and we work through that process together. This is for cost-effective mitigation measures. So I put some examples in here. But I think what's really important to know about this is that it really favors engineered solutions because of its cost-effectiveness requirement. So it's really thinking about, post-Helene, we have an easy argument to say we are susceptible to flooding. And so it's going to look at whatever infrastructure you're applying for, how does it withstand those fluctuations in water, or how does it store that water or move that water to protect the surrounding community and area. And so it is a great resource. And also, I think when we think about our values and thinking about environmental restoration or quality, it doesn't quite address some of those issues. So we have to keep thinking about how we layer on above that. And that's when we get up to CDBG-DR. We like to say this is our opportunity to build back better. So not taking away any of the two pieces below that, but what can we do in addition to that? And that's where we see that opportunity for environmental restoration, additional resilience, green infrastructure, and additionally access to program amenities and thinking, is this really the best way to get people to a pool? Or is this pool actually the pool that people need in this community, right? That's when we can start asking those types of questions when we're looking at this specific funding source. And then I put other grants funding on top of that. Those really can flip depending on when the CDBG-DR funding comes into play. But there's, lots of other grants out there that, we'll have some examples in the presentation of things we're seeking. But the way we're looking at that is where are the gaps? And how do we look at additional funding sources to fill in those gaps to meet the need that our community is saying we want out of a project, to meet those outcomes? So moving on, just a little setup of how do we get to this point? Because I know we haven't talked to this board about CDBG-DR before. It's a mouthful. But really what happened is there was the Helene Recovery Priority Survey. I believe this was also sent in your packet. We had nearly 7,000 residents who took this and said, what do we kind of care about in terms of recovering from Tropical Storm Helene? That is the groundwork for how we started to think about what are the priorities we want to address. We built on that community engagement when we did the community engagement for the action plan. So every community that receives this type of funding comes up with the action plan that says, here's kind of the framework of how we're going to spend the funds. That's where that unmet needs assessment comes in. There was community engagement done during that process. But again, we tried to build off of the recovery priority survey so we weren't duplicating those efforts. That action plan was adopted by City Council, and then that's when the city nerds get involved and start saying, what are all the regulatory requirements and how do we meet what's in the action plan to spend these dollars to evaluate how they go so that we remain in compliance. And so each program within the CDBG-DR land will have its own program manual. So housing, multifamily housing is going to have one. Small business grants has one, right? So this is really getting into the minutia of how do we stay in compliance as those dollars roll out. And within that manual, it has the evaluation criteria of how we looked at different projects and said, how do you both meet the outcomes that we're looking for and stay in compliance with the program? So on the next slide, we gave just a little highlight summary of what we heard in the community engagement that I think really resonates with the infrastructure choices we're making, which is very strong support for infrastructure, very strong support for rebuilding stronger, thinking about how we're using our space more meaningfully, and like living with water and the risks that we have, and what that environmental restoration component looks like. And this gives you a snapshot of what the evaluation criteria are that are in that program manual. So these dollars need to be spent within a significant period of time, which is 6 years. So we need to think about, can we get this done? How does this connect to the needs that were needed and exacerbated by Tropical Storm Helene? How are we including stakeholder engagement, alignment with existing city plans? How are we leveraging other funds? And then again, what does that benefit to our low and moderate income residents? And also, what is our opportunity to mitigate risk from future disaster? So I'm going to dive into the 3 projects that we're recommending. The first one being the French Broad Riverfront. So they requested $22.5 million. We're recommending funding that to the full amount. This one came in highest during our evaluation. These are just a list of things of where they earned points that got them that highest evaluation criteria. And I think the most important thing is how do we have this, again, comprehensive approach, knowing that the rest of the recovery funding sources we have really are kind of a piecemeal, and how do we kind of bring this to our community and do this at one time instead of tearing it up now and then coming back a couple years later and tearing it up again. So we're going to see this reflected in the next project as well, which is Azalea. So they...
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So can you explain the funding requested? Was that requested by the city or?
So the way it worked is that city staff submitted applications and they requested the dollar amount. So the project leads.
And then CDBG-DR then saw that and recommended for the, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's all, there's a process in the manual that says city staff can apply, then they can submit an application based on if they're eligible and they're kind of ready to go. There's some criteria that helped whittle that down. After that application is submitted, our CDBG-DR administrative team that works for the city goes through and makes sure, like, yes, they meet all of these things, and then there's an evaluation group that consists of the recovery coordination, our cost recovery folks in finance, and some of the city manager's office to look at those applications and make a recommendation to the city manager. Yeah.
I have one more clarifying question that applies to this and the next slide. It reads as develop a comprehensive design plan to rebuild. So is this $22.5 million the design plan itself?
It's
or
all.
Is it the entire
It's the
project?
full life cycle of the project.
So it's the construction of the project
Yes.
and everything else?
Yes. So some of this will go towards design and some of this will also go towards construction. So it should say design and build. So similar format here, you can see what staff recommended was 10.2. We recommend funding it at 10. I think some important things to note about this project, it's already secured $2.4 million in state recovery funds, and it's seeking additional, I don't remember what Part F stands for. You can give me that acronym maybe?
And Recreation Trust Fund.
So that went to council to get approval to apply for at their previous meeting. But again, both this and the French Broad, it's starting with that FEMA PA. We're going to take full advantage of that. We have 2 applications that are going in for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and then we're trying to add this on top as well as some of these other funding sources. And then the third project is the pretreatment project at North Fork Reservoir. As I know a lot of you are familiar, this is where 80% of our drinking water comes from. This was requested at $109 million. All 3 of these projects are still in the design phase. That number will most likely change. But we're recommending reserving the remainder of the funding allocation, which adds up to be $89.7 million to reserve. And so the check marks here tell you about the valuation criteria. The pluses are additional information I think is important that help gives context to why we're making this recommendation. So this project is pursuing a hazard mitigation grant fund to fund it in its entirety. That is a competitive grant. It has a number of processes that it needs to go through for approval. So we want to make sure that in the instance that that doesn't come to fruition, that we have a resource available, because this is like a foundational project for recovery.
So Bridget, one question, is that HMGP funding, how much was requested there?
So what was requested in that application, I believe, was 179 for the pre-treatment. It's bundled with the alternate transmission line in that application because they're linked. So the total application was for $230 million.
$230 million.
But that includes the transmission line as well as the pre-treatment system.
And if that funding came through, would that mean that the CDBG money could be used for something else?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. But I think at this point in time, we want to make sure that resource is available, because if that resource doesn't come through or it comes through partially, we're looking at putting that into our rate model and having the ratepayers pay for that. And that's a significant capital cost that we want to avoid to our customers and our residents and businesses that utilize our water.
Okay.
So this is showing it to you in a table format. So these are the recommended funding amounts. You can see we deducted those compliance costs, but it comes out to that $125 million that you see referenced in the action plan.
Bridget,
Yeah.
quick question about your comment about the costs potentially changing between those 3 projects. If it does go, let's say it goes up through the design phase with Azalea to $12 million, would you take it from one of these other 3 projects, or would you just raise the money from some other source?
I mean, I think there's, knowing what we know at that time will be different. So we'd have to base that decision off the most up-to-date information we had, right? So depending on where we were with understanding the hazard mitigation grant program might influence that decision. But I think based on what I know in this moment right now, we would stick with this and look for sources in other places.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Welcome has his hand raised.
Yeah, good morning, Bridget. Don't want to hold you to this, but is there any feeling for a timeline on the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program approval process for the North Fork plant?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is no timeline for the timeline. As I mentioned, this is a program that is run by FEMA, a different set, and it runs where the state is the official applicant. And so what I can say is, like, we're working as closely as we can with everybody involved to educate people on the awareness and the importance of all the projects we've submitted under the HMGP process and program, and are going to advocate that those move as quickly as possible, but it's not a timeline that is set in a way that we can say, we'll know in 6 months.
Is it not the case that the hazard mitigation program is voluntary, and therefore it makes it difficult to project its total effect?
So the program has a number of different parts to it, and so it's all voluntary. There is a section that goes for property owners if they wanted to sell their property and put it into a deed-restricted space. There's also an opportunity to elevate a private property, or stabilize it. That is kind of the private property section. There's also, in the same grant program, the infrastructure applications that are available to public entities. And that's a competitive process that we're entering. That's what these applications are into. And we'll go through a significant amount of review. We'll probably get a lot of requests for information, and we'll work through that program to get awarded in that way.
You know, one question from a timing standpoint, if there's no timeline on the HMGP, don't know when that's going to be, are we going to face any kind of deadline on the community development block grant money that we have to come back to make a decision if we don't get clarity on the HMGP?
That's in the realm of possibilities. I think what I can say with confidence is that we know a lot more about our recovery landscape than we did a year ago from today, and I think that's going to be true a year from right now. And so it's definitely a consideration that we need to make sure we're staying in touch with constantly along the way.
Okay.
And that's part of every recovery funding source has a period of performance that we're engaging with regularly.
Okay.
And I'd say the good thing about that is that keeps our foot on the gas, right?
I think Mike had it.
Yeah, that's related to the previous question. My understanding is the CDBG-DR funds have a 6-year timeframe that the projects need to be. My question is, do they need to be spent or encumbered with the CDBG funds in that 6-year period?
I can get the answer to that followed up for you. Spent. I'm hearing from the back from our CDBG-DR experts, it's spent.
So if you have a contract let, that's not the same thing as actually spent, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it is a reimbursement-based program as the rest of our federal recovery sources are, so you have to spend the money to be able to reimburse the money. There are opportunities to potentially request an extension, but those are not guaranteed.
Okay, so thank you for that information. If the other funding source, the hazard mitigation thing that we don't have a timeline on, if that's, God forbid, 2 years from now before we get any indication, or 18 months, then we'd only have to utilize these funds. We'd only have, 3 years, something like that. The window continues to contract, I guess, is the point that I'm making.
That's correct. What I would say to that is that we are not waiting to move on any of these projects. All of these projects are moving forward with design. So we are moving them at the speed of which we can. So it's not like we're not doing anything until we get to that point. And we're actively seeking additional funds, thinking about like cost recovery measures. You know, we've applied for and received some state revolving funds that run through EPA, through DEQ. As you know, there's a loan attached with that, with opportunity to maybe use that as a bridge in cost recovery in the meantime, but we're not waiting to make a decision to do these projects. We know these projects are a priority. We're just figuring out how do we best fund them. So yes, we're going to have a different conversation a year from today, but I want us to stay grounded and focused on what we can do right now and not get lost in the what ifs.
No question about that, and I appreciate what you're doing. It just seems to me, not to preempt future discussion, but it just seems to me with the somewhat uncertain, if not erratic, nature of FEMA funding with what's been said in the past and what we can rely on, that there's a lot of reason to hold on to this if you're in the viewpoint of this project until we get some more certainty. With that, I say thank you for the information.
And I mean, I think that really takes us into the next slide, which is the questions, which is what are the pros and the cons, right? And I think that's what you're talking to, is the pros of this is we have some uncertainty around this and we want to, that's part of why we're making this recommendation, but would love to hear from you about what are the other things, one, that you think are pros and cons to the strategy, and two, what do you think are the questions we can anticipate from our community as we're communicating this out with folks, we just went into some of the complexity and scratched the surface, and how do we make sure we're bringing everybody along with us?
Before we open up for discussion, I wanted to clarify real quick. My understanding is that we're not making an official recommendation to City Council, but instead having a more nuanced discussion so that all of the potential questions coming from the community can be weighed when City Council is making their decision. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, cool.
Is there going to be a point, thank you, is there going to be a point where this board does make a recommendation to City Council on this?
It as like a voting strategy. The conversation that you all are going to have here today regarding the pros and cons, it's the conversation that's going to be shared with the PF5 committee when they meet at the end of the month to help influence the direction that the council wants to ultimately go. So it's not a vote. It's more of a conversation that will continue with council.
Thank you, D. Terrell. And as always, these meetings are going to be available to the council if they want to come back and look at the nature and the content of the conversation. Is that right?
That is correct. These are recorded meetings, and
But if I may, I'd like to point out that it seems to me that clearly the worst devastation of the Tropical Storm Helene devastation was the temporary destruction of our water system, which had a whole ripple of economic and social and physical ramifications. I'd just like to point out the extreme importance, it seems to me, of water.
Well said.
So I'll ask kind of, there's no agenda here. I just want to ask this question just to try to stimulate thought. And that is, the turbidity of the water is at the top of everyone's mind. It came from the storm, and that's why a lot of people in the evaluation and the surveys and so forth voted for that, I think, as one of the highest priorities. The chance of this happening again at this type of level could be fairly low. And what I just wonder is all the other water infrastructure projects that are out there, are there other things that may have a higher chance, like leaking water line? I don't know. I'm just throwing out the question. In anticipation of what questions the city may get, are there other things that maybe have a higher chance or would have to be addressed in the next 5 years or whatever like that, that may be something that ought to be at least considered? I'm not saying that it should, but not to say that I know what they are or whether it's a good idea, but just because people see the big storm, it's at the presence of their mind, that's what we've got to. But it may be we're throwing $89 million at a 2% type risk or 1% risk, and we've got a bunch of 80% risk out there with other aspects of the water system. And I'm not saying that's a good way to go, but I think it's worth at least
some
the time of pros and
communication
cons.
about the like comprehensive approach to maintaining a resilient water system.
That's right,
And what
that's
else
right.
is out there,
Yeah.
yeah?
And I,
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Michael.
Thanks. In response to that, it puts a question in my mind. I think it was indicated earlier that the hazard mitigation funding requested not only was the North Fork permanent pretreatment improvements, but also the alternate route for a new transmission line. To my mind, that is equal in importance to the pretreatment improvements. Can be validated, I think, in 20 years. The main transmission line that's located in the floodplain has been blown out by a flood, which certainly probably much more prevalent than what happened to the turbidity. My question is, in any of this 89 million, is it going to be applied to the alternate route, or does it not meet the criteria and therefore only the pretreatment project was submitted for this funding? Is that clear what I'm asking?
Only the pretreatment project was submitted for this funding. As I said, we are pursuing the alternate transmission line. I think additionally, we were able to restore that, and as unfortunate as it was that those transmission lines washed away, they were able to be repaired and put something in place much quicker than the turbidity at the reservoir. So if we're looking at them in comparison to one another in terms of how we can respond quickly, I think what we learned in the previous storm is that we can build those pipes if we have to, but being able to treat the water was something that took time, and this would help us deal with that.
Thank you.
Eligibility question. John's point is very well taken. Like, if we have potentially compromised infrastructure elsewhere, that could lead to some sort of more likely problem. I think exploring fixing that is a good idea, but to what degree are CDBG-DR funds available to infrastructure that wasn't impacted by the disaster?
There is a portion, there's a percentage that can be exempt from having that, meeting some of those criteria. We can get that specific number for you if that's of interest, but there is a small percentage that could go. But the premise of it, since it's disaster recovery funding, is there needs to be a tie back to Helene, and it needs to benefit our vulnerable residents.
Sure, understood.
And are preventative measures considered a tieback to Helene if it's something that wasn't directly damaged? You know,
It could be, potentially. Okay. Thanks for your time.
One more question, sorry.
Yep.
Kind of came to mind, but if we're anticipating questions from the public and the decision here is to allocate the remainder to the pretreatment facility, does that mean that maybe some of the other projects or issues that were identified as maybe number 4 and 5 will not get funded by CDBG-DR funds?
That's correct, unless
Okay.
this funding's able to be released. Because as I said, it's the funding of last resort. We're trying to exhaust the other resources, but knowing that this is such a big capital investment, and so, as I said, foundational to our recovery, that's why we anticipate this. If we are successful with those strategies, we'll be able to release this funds for other things. But those other projects, unless we got additional DR funding, which we have made that request, would have to come from another funding source.
Okay.
and could some of those other projects be funded from future water and sewer bonds?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If it was water specific, yes.
Yeah, water specific, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that the city is approaching a decision to issue another round of general obligation bonds, which I imagine will provide a significant source of additional funding for infrastructure recovery.
That's possible. I mean, we passed a round of bonds in the 2024 election, and those were for things that we already had thought about pre-Helene. So I don't know when we'll have another bond on the ballot. Those bonds are different than what we can do for water and looking at our water CIP, and we are looking at that, and that rate model will come forward to council, and there'll be a conversation around that as well.
Well, for what it's worth, maybe nothing, understand that discussion is taking place about another issue in 2027 or 2028.
That could be possible. I'm not sure that there's been a commitment to the round, but I know that that is a consideration people are thinking about.
Yeah, just point of fact, and I don't believe this is incorrect, what I'm about to say, but I don't think any general obligation bonds have been used on the water system since about 1991. 1996, as I recall, was the first pure revenue bond the water fund had ever utilized to finance the construction of the Mills River water treatment plant. And I believe the bonds issued since then have all been revenue bonds, and I would expect any future bonds to be revenue bonds, not general obligation bonds. I just wanted to clarify that if in fact that's true.
I mean, I believe that's like when we're talking about water funding is different than we talk about like parks projects. So there's different funding strategies that you can use for different things. Water has its own set of regulatory requirements around it, in addition to some of the other requirements that other city projects have and how they're funded. So I'm sure we can get some follow-up information about those specifics if you really want to dive into the weeds of how we fund.
I was thinking about revenue bonds
Yeah.
for the reservoir, but general obligation bonds to make up for other projects.
Right.
So given these priorities that, the city staff set forth, what are the other questions that might come up, kind of in your spheres that we should address? Because we have some time to talk about this today.
Yeah, I have some comments. I want to ask so many other questions about things I saw up there, but I'm going to focus on what we have here on the screen. And so the water project, I think questions that the community will have are based around timeframes. And so just being able to clearly explain those. I reviewed the presentation before the meeting, and your presentation, walking me through it, answered all the questions that I had after seeing it. So I don't know what that means, but potentially having, outreach or engagement where there's someone there to explain the graphs or the diagrams or all of that, I think would be really helpful. So I think timeline are questions that people will have, and then one question will be, what happens if we don't receive funding? Like, what is the plan? That's something that I'm thinking of, and I appreciated your comment about moving forward and not getting lost in the what ifs because there's so many. So again, I think just like clear communication around like what people's first questions will be about what if and time, and then how the priorities were made for the projects. I think those are like really low-hanging fruit questions that you may have to just repeat or answer those questions over and over again, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just echo that. Hearing 6 years for some people, like 6 years until I can go walk on the Greenway again, may sound like a lot, but there's so much engagement I think I've seen from the city about these different projects that as long as we keep that momentum going and show that steps are being taken towards an endpoint, then I think that'll assuage a lot of people's concerns.
Yeah, and I think comparing it to existing projects that people know or have seen the city do, So 6 years may seem like a long time for someone, but I'm looking at these projects and I think we only have 6 years to go through design,
That's how I
construction.
feel.
So I'm
That's
like,
how I feel.
okay, 5. So I'm panicking right now.
Yeah,
So
we're sweating, for sure.
Actually, I am. So I think maybe showing an example of another project, maybe it's not the same scale, but show them like when it started, how long it took, just so people begin to understand like the frame of reference or something about larger projects, I think could be helpful in that way.
Yeah, to that point, and I'll fall into the what if trap again. My question is, you know, if the money does come through, how do we spend $90 million like that, you know? You know, right, we need a lot of money, of course, and there's shortfalls everywhere, but I would like to know that there are plans to implement and spend that money before the time runs out, too. That's another question. That's just another what-if question that's sort of lingering in the back of my head.
Yeah, I thought about that too. Like, does the city have contractor listed to do the water treatment improvement project once the money comes through, and knowing that we're lined up and ready to go when the money hits? I think would be.
Yeah, I mean, we're moving a lot of projects through right now, a lot of projects we had no idea of doing, and we're also trying to stay committed to what we already were telling our community we were doing with like our bond projects. And so we are like, we're full of good work, which is really exciting. And I would say the other thing is that part of this allocation is that some reserved for planning dollars. And so there's a similar process that's going to roll out for planning dollars, and that's going to go to people and environment. But there'll be some additional efforts that are happening in the meantime with planning as well. And so I don't think we're backing away from doing things. We're just trying to figure out, how do we prioritize, and what do we like hit the accelerator on, what are we coasting on, what do we pump the brakes on, right? Like, we gotta kind of navigate that space, and I think the more we can navigate that as a collective, the better we'll be able to move quickly, find additional funding, and kind of move through these projects.
I've also seen some intentionality about saying, oh, this project was funded with pre-Helene dollars.
Mhm.
Like, I think that's helpful too, to like say, okay, this was already funded years ago. Like, it's not, we're not sacrificing something for this because it was a different pot of money. And like,
Right.
kind of clarifying where the money comes from is really helpful.
Okay, good.
You know, it seems to make sense to me. I was a CFO for a long time, and timing is really important. But maybe looking at it, if in fact the criteria is reimbursement, meaning we spend the money and get it reimbursed within 6 years, which means we got to back up from that to contracting and go all the way back to that, and then look at that timeline and then say, when would we need to make a decision if, you know, we don't do this, if we don't do the infrastructure, the turbidity, and then look at that time for what another project may be, so that we have kind of a Gantt chart, rough cut, not real detail, but just rough cut, so that we have kind of a feel of when we would have to come back and make a decision about something else if we would.
Right.
It's not a what if, it's just kind of project planning type thing. So I would think that would help a little bit, would make some sense.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you. Before we move on, is there anything else group wants to make? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Charlie. I don't know when the conversation here is supposed to stop and move into the public comment. So I just wanted to, as a former municipal water systems professional and specifically the director of the Asheville Water Resources Department, given the uncertainty of the FEMA funding and the uncertainty of the timing of the FEMA funding, to recommend that any dollar of this $89 million would be available for anything else, in my judgment, given those parameters, is extremely reckless. And I feel like I have a duty to tell the rest of the board that, based upon my experience, and I just wanted to give you the benefit of that.
And I forgot, I do have a couple more slides. So I wanted to close the loop on what we're going to do with this input. So again, as Dee mentioned, we're going to share this with the Council's Policy, Finance, and Infrastructure Committee at their February meeting. We're going to take this in mind as, I think, in addition to like, what are those decision points along the way, and how do we think about this if we're able to release some of these funds, either in part or whole, and then how do we bring everybody along with us about it. And the next slide has a timeline. Again, there's that February 24th meeting. I also wanted to put up here the additional touch points you all have with two of the projects that we just talked about in this allocation, which are the Riverfront Parks projects. So that second wave of engagements happening on the 28th, and then those projects are going to come back to you at your March 3rd and May 8th meeting and go to council on March 10th. So that's kind of some of the iterative process of how we dig into the what is happening in these projects versus just how are we going to pay for it. So I think with that is all I had.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Mike, I want to go back to your warning as a layperson and also just as the function of this board is to kind of translate, some of this more nuanced financial, sort of decision making for the public. Can you explain why you believe this is a reckless decision to reserve this funding, this $80 million?
Charlie, I think it's a great decision to reserve the $89 million for the North Fork pretreatment project. Thank you for letting me clarify that. I certainly think that that's what we should do. What I was calling reckless would be to say that, well, we'll give the Water Resources Department only $75 million, and that'll give $14 million for additional other projects. That's what I think would be reckless.
Okay, yeah, thanks for clarifying. I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, me too.
Before we move to public comment, is there anything else that anybody wants to bring up for this discussion? All right, move it along. Next we'll have public comment if there is any in the queue. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to ask Logan or Dee. Logan, do we have anybody on the line in the queue?
No.
All right. Anybody in person who wants to get up and talk to us? Okay. Well, then I'll just move on to the last bit. Some future agenda items. One that was brought up is for the Riverfront Parks recovery projects, having the consultants actually introduce those concepts to the board. Do you want to talk about that?
That is correct. So we can expect at our March meeting, remember this February meeting is a special call meeting just to kind of go through the discussion we just had so that we can share that information with Council's PFI committee later this month. At our March meeting, though, we should have the additional concepts to be considered for the two park projects. And we'll need to bounce those ideas and feedback off of this board before it goes back to council in March. So the two park projects timeline is kind of dictating what is coming before this board to be considered and also shared with council moving forward. So we plan to have the consultants with us, join us for our March meeting to just kind of talk through both concepts for both park projects.
Okay. Mike, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Weigh in or provide feedback on the parks projects. I think it might be helpful if there's time to do this, is if there's anything in particular we should be focused on, because we'll be looking at conceptual designs for a park, and that could get very long, and, you know, I think there'll be a lot to talk about, a lot of enthusiasm. So if there's ways to sort of target what you all need from this board, I think it would be really helpful.
Thanks for that, Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there will be a lot of information linked in the agenda, as has been in the past meetings. I encourage everybody on the board to spend some time going through the information. It's a lot.
Well, and there's the February 28th open house. So if you want to go to that and see some of the concepts beforehand, then we'll have a better understanding when we get to our meeting.
And where
Good
will
call,
that
yeah.
open house be?
AB Tech.
AB Tech.
All right, so February 28th at AB Tech at what time? Do we know? Okay,
Thank you.
all right. Cool, thanks, everybody. All right, next.
Mike,
Sorry.
had a-
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I had a
Sorry, yeah, sorry, Mike.
That's quite all right. D. Terrell, you mentioned the March meeting, and we're going to be talking about the concepts on the River Park recovery projects. Are we not also at the March meeting expecting a presentation or information on the water projects as well?
We are. We have Bill Hart, our Water Resource Director, here with us today. He's been joining us for these meetings, but we're going to hear directly from Bill at the March meeting with an update on the water projects. Yes.
Well, that's wonderful. It's always good to hear from Mr. Hart. Thank you.
Then to review at the next meeting, we're going to hear about each of the Riverfront Parks recovery projects and the upcoming water projects. Great. Next bit, we mentioned this briefly last meeting. Dave has passed on the Connect Buncombe Making Strong Connections for a Resilient Future white paper. It's linked in the agenda. I encourage you all to give it a read. Dave, did you want to talk about that anymore?
Given the fact that everything we are doing is a result of climate change, a devastating planetary event, we at Connect Buncombe have prepared a white paper on our thoughts as to how to build that realization into what we're doing and come out of it with a lot of work by everybody, with a system which will strive to mitigate climate change by slowing down the water as it rushes through our greenway and green infrastructure areas. So this is that document, and I hope that you will all take the time to read this 5-page document so we can have a full discussion of it at our March meeting. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dave. And then the last bit is something that we have briefly talked about often in these, specifically in these parks projects. Art and artists are used to sell the project, sell its, sort of community and aesthetic value. So I'm just doing my duty as the representative from the Public Art Commission to say that I would love for us to have in mind the follow-through for that. Not only, using that as inspiration for doing these projects, but let's think about how can we incorporate the public art into the projects and ensure that there's still a place for that when the budget crunch happens toward the end of the project.
So Charlie, you and I had this conversation at Wrong Way about public art, but do you see an opportunity to have that discussion in one of the future meetings? Like, it sounds like March 3rd is going to be pretty packed with information, so.
I'm not pushing to have this as a official agenda item for the future meetings, but it is something that I do want us to keep in mind because it's going to become increasingly relevant as we begin to act on these projects.
Do we need to vote on anything today?
There's no vote needed for this, this meeting except to adjourn. If nobody, if nobody has any other comments or anything to bring up. All right, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
To adjourn.
All right. I will, here, let me pull up the roll call list. All right, Kate and Kaya.
Aye.
Kenny Armstrong.
I'm going to keep us here.
Aye.
Joe Balkin.
Aye.
Marty Benson. Aye. AJ Hardy.
Aye.
Shavonda Harper.
Aye.
Michael Holcomb.
Aye.
David Nutter.
Aye.
Tim Ormond.
Okay, I'll be back in Asheville next week. Look forward to seeing you.
John Pierce.
Aye.
And Charlie.